You might have heard that clay has a memory. This is typically used to mean that any stress applied to the clay during the making process will manifest itself later when it's fired. For example, if you're slab building and you bend a sheet of clay then flatten it back out, it might stay flat as it dries, but when you fire it, it will bend back at least part way. Another way this manifests itself is that thrown pieces are subject to rotational torque as they're thrown, which causes the clay to twist in a helix. This can be clearly seen when throwing a marbled piece, as a vertical pattern becomes twisted around. Common pottery wisdom says that this helix stress will untwist itself as the piece dries and is fired. In other words, 2 points on a piece that were vertically aligned when it was thrown will not be vertically aligned by the time it's fired. I'm particularly interested in this because I use the laser level to align my handles vertically when attaching them to either a trimmed leather hard piece or when using drippy slip to a slightly softer than leather hard piece. I aim to attach my handles perfectly vertically, but I often get questions as to whether or not this will result in them no longer being aligned vertically by the time the piece is fired. Having made thousands of mugs this way, I know that if this effect is present, it barely affects the handles at all. Using the laser level at the stage I do generally results in a handle that's very close to perfectly aligned, and I know that even with the laser level, I can quite easily be out by a millimetre or so when placing the handle, and it seems to me that any effect from the clay untwisting is smaller than the error that's introduced by human fallibility. But I wanted to test this. So what I'm doing here is throwing two pieces and attempting to see how much they'll untwist from thrown to fired. I'm going to throw two pieces, one of which will be as uncompressed as possible, so I'll center quickly and won't compress the walls. The other piece will have a longer centering process and have the walls repeatedly compressed. This should create a different level of rotational stress between the two pieces, and we can see how much difference, if any, that makes to our end result. The first step is throwing the pieces. I'm using 350 grams of clay and throwing them to approximately 10 centimeters tall. The self-leveling laser is pointed directly over the center of the wheel head, meaning that the intersection with the clay wall should be vertical and consistent across days, as I'll be returning the piece to the wheel at every stage of the process to check the alignment. Having thrown the piece, I want to mark the piece top and bottom in alignment with the laser. The laser line itself is a millimetre or two wide, which makes it hard to be perfectly precise with the marks, but should give a good idea over 10 centimetres as to whether or not the clay is moving much. The next day I return the piece to the wheel head. It's now leather hard, and I align the laser with the bottom mark and add a new top mark to see how much it's moved overnight. The day after that, the piece is dry enough to pop off the bat, and once again I return it to the wheel head with the piece centered and the laser intersecting with the middle of the wheel head, and I align the laser with the bottom mark and add a new top mark. To make sure that the piece continues to sit flat, I trim a little clay out of the middle of the foot. This ensures that it will sit flat on the outer foot ring and will keep it consistently stable over the next few measures. The piece is fully dry now, and I'll repeat the process and mark it with an underglazed pencil. Finally, the piece has been fired to full temperature and I can return it to the wheel for a final time and check the final alignment. There's a small margin of error in the position of the marks, but both of them are coming out at approximately 2 millimeters difference between the starting mark and the final mark. That's 2 millimeters horizontal difference over around 85 millimeters vertical distance when fired, and a top diameter of around 85 millimeters as well. Calculating the central angle from these numbers is quite easy. I'll explain it briefly, but don't worry if you don't want to follow along, just let your eyes glaze over for a few seconds. To work out the central angle, all you need to know is what proportion of the circumference this 2 millimeters represents. The circumference would be pi times diameter, so 3.14 times 85 millimeters, which is around 267 millimeters. Dividing this by our 2 millimeters gives us 133, and then you just divide 360 degrees by that 133 to get an answer of around 2.7 degrees. This means that my clay thrown with either amount of compression will untwist around 3 degrees for every 10 centimeters of height. Importantly though, you can see from the marks that the majority of this untwisting happened before the second mark. That means the majority of this effect will happen prior to my handles being attached, either with my drippy slippy pieces where it's attached while the piece is still on the bat, or my regular pieces where the handles are attached after the piece has been trimmed. For even my largest mugs, this will give an untwisting effect of under 1.5 millimeters over the length of the entire piece, and less so over the length of the handle. The effect is definitely there, It is very small with this clay, but it will vary from clay to clay. You could run the same experiment with your clay and see what effect you get. And please let me know in the comments if you've done this or if you have any experience with the memory of clay affecting your pieces. There are a number of ways it can manifest, and I think that'll be the topic for another video, but for now I'm glad I can put an approximate number on the amount of untwisting my clay experiences as it dries.